LGBTIQ+ persons. I'm very, very happy to have you on board today. Our second panelist is Keval Hari. He is the director of the Gay and Lesbian Memory in Action Archives, GALA, based at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg in South Africa. In the role as director, he's committed to growing GALA into a center for research and advocacy for the equality, freedom, and justice for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex people. Keval is a qualified attorney and completed his articles at Edward Nathan Sonneberg's. Very, very warm welcome to you too, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on board as well. I'm really happy that you both agreed to discuss these issues today with us. And without further ado, I really want to jump into the discussion for today, which we said to be challenges and prospects for transnational activism to advance the rights of LGBTIQ+ persons. They will both get us started with a short intro, ask them to prepare, and then we will dive into the discussion. As in the last discussions to the audience, you are very welcome to post your questions. You're also welcome to enable your microphone if you tell us beforehand that you want to contribute something or have a question. You can post in the chat. We also have a Q&A window, so feel free to use all of these tools to get engaged with the panelists and the discussion today. So Jerry will get us started and we'll talk a little bit about her experience with regards to transnational activism means for Jerry and her work with the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, which are the main advantages of transnational activism. And I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Marielle. I hope everyone can hear me well. Yeah, as you introduced me, my name is Njeri. I work for the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission in Kenya. And our work is basically to use the law to create, I think what I like to interpret as a possibility for happiness, an equal chance at happiness for people who are found to be LGBTIQ within the country. A lot of my work centers around justice, right? The idea of justice and the systems that are put in place to imagine what justice would be. And I think the greatest contestation is the feeling and the reality that people like me, people who identify as LGBTIQ, seem not to be intended as beneficiaries of justice, but then also seem to have a particularly challenging experience running within the running or navigating the system of justice. And so what we put forward as an intervention is a pro bono legal clinic where we offer legal aid and legal support for people with issues arising out of the sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, and kind of try to make it almost human, the interactions with the rules of justice. And outside of that, I think our most visible and basically the bastion of our work is in strategic litigation, where we have been litigating for the last 10 years towards decriminalization of homosexuality in Kenya, successfully to end forced anal examinations as a way to determine a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, and further to prosecute them as according to the laws of our country that criminalize same gender, same-sex, consensual sex, and also have been litigating towards registration of LGBTIQ organizations, which are to date still not legally registered or allowed to operate with the words gay and lesbian in their names or within their articles of association. And lastly, litigating around the right to education for LGBTIQ learners, which is litigation we've embarked in the last 6 months or so. So we do have quite a huge, I think, large portfolio of other kinds of litigation, but also strategic litigation. And when I was invited to be a part of this conversation, I think that's where my thought centered around the work that we do and how it plays out within a cross-border transnational space, and what opportunities have been there, what we've utilized, what we've seen as advantageous, and what has not necessarily been ideal. I think one of the things that has been most important to us has been learning, has been sharing of lessons. I don't know whether to say it's I don't know whether to say it's an advantage or not, but we have, I think, similar colonial past, colonial histories, and because of that and other factors, other historic factors, we end up with, I think, similar types of legal landscapes and similar types of cultural, religious, political rhetoric that surrounds the work that we do and the lives that we live. And it has been really key for us to sit together as people working within the Kenyan movement, but then also have the ear of friends, colleagues, siblings who are working across borders to interrogate the ways in which the legal landscape plays out for all of us, and additionally the ways in which we have been able to successfully or not engage the systems or advocate in a way that gives lives to the spirit of our work, basically. So strategic litigation, for example, has continued to be a cross-border transnational conversation, even where the laws that we're seeking to change are only changed in the countries that we're working in. Within the country, the lessons from across the borders have been specifically useful. The ways in which we institute litigation, the ways in which we choose petitioners, the ways how we engage with the judiciary has not been unique to any country, really. I think Kenya has learned from Botswana. Botswana has learned from South Africa. South Africa has learned from Uganda, etc. Like, there has been a lot of transnational conversations, and I think there has been a lot of subsequent success. And where there have been what would loosely term as failures, only in the ways of the pronouncement of the decisions, and not for anything else, there has been, I think, concerted effort to sit together and analyze and strategize and look back and see what we would have done different, or what has been done differently that has been more successful. So strategic litigation is one of the ways, one of the spaces in which we've had really important and really effective learning exchanges across across countries, and where we can easily measure what success has looked like across the borders. I think the other thing is that there has been, so within the conversation of strategic litigation, there has been such such I don't know what the right word would be to use, but it's been very clear what solidarity has looked like for different countries working on different issues and specific issues. For example, I remember in Kenya, when we were litigating around decriminalization, we had not only technical support from different countries, we actually had people traveling from Kampala, from Gaborone, from Johannesburg, to come and attend court sessions, to sit with lawyers, to sit with activists, to talk about what this looks like when we're trying to educate the community about what the possibilities could be, and I think it was one of the places that, as activists, as individuals, we drew a lot of support, right? We drew a lot of strength from people flying in from Lagos and saying, look, it's really tough on our end right now, but we're here to celebrate with you this little wins that you're making, and that was really important. And I think that truly reinforces the belief that we have in the community and in the work that we do, and in the people that we surround ourselves, ourselves in, and outside of that, moving from a national sort of advocacy to regional advocacy to engagement with, for example, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where we have had conversations and have planned and strategized as people representing individual countries and having specific advocacy priorities, and kind of created a system or a method in which we would all benefit, in presenting our issues together. So whether it has meant scheduling sessions within the NGO forum in Banjul at the African Commission, whether it has meant that we are having dinners with or working lunches with the commissioners or whoever was priority at that time. I think those conversations across countries, across movements, across identities, I think, have been very useful and effective in the work that we do. So I just want to leave it there for now in terms of introducing the work and introducing my thoughts around transnational activism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was an amazing overview already, and I hope we can pick up many of these points, and I'm sure we will. And with that, I want to ask Keval to come in with a sort of introductory statement on you and your work and your perception of what transnational activism means for you, and Gala, and maybe the challenges, but yeah, obviously also prospects.
Great, thank you so much, and Jerry, thank you for setting us up for a really great conversation. I think we'll definitely get back to this question of strategic litigation and how we can find areas of solidarity in that. But as I was listening to you, I was also really thinking about the role of Gala. So Gala is an archive which we have this incredible historical repository or collection which speaks to kind of lived experiences of queer life in South Africa. And more, we're really looking to engage with organizations and partners all across the continent in terms of really uncovering this queer history. And our objective stems from speaking against a narrative of homosexuality being un-African, which we hear all across the continent. And I think in that sense, there's already this thread of commonality in which the work that we're doing all across the continent, or activists are doing all across the continent, is really pushing against that narrative. And specifically for the archive, our role, which perhaps is not necessarily one of picketing or really, taking governments to court or different organizations to court, we kind of see ourselves very much as this gentle activist. And our role there is quite important. In one, it's about uncovering the lived experiences, and by doing so, ensuring that historically queer voices have been deliberately taken out or removed from history to also deny our very existence. And so the role of the Queer Archive is quite radical in that it's really about reinserting and reimagining queer voices within our collective history. And by doing that, really challenging contemporary understandings of lived experiences today, which then takes us back to how we challenge and work with different organizations in kind of creating a queer visibility, particularly one that has, I think, an intrinsically and specifically queer African identity. And I know that that's quite a loaded term, right? Because it could mean different things in different spaces. But I think it's also quite important in terms of thinking about transnational activism, because not only is it important within the continent of how we kind of show solidarity towards each other, but I think it also allows us to form a much stronger grouping, which kind of also speaks to the rest of the world, even to our supporters in the West, to say that we don't always find it useful to speak in a particular language, which include like LGBT activism, or where there's a push that decriminalization has to come first in order for it really allows us to, I think about more strategically about what activism looks like for us. And then I think also importantly, it raises really important questions around what does solidarity and transnational activism look particularly within the global South, where I think our challenges are a lot more, we can find a lot more commonality, particularly around some of the challenges that we face. And so in terms of thinking about the work that Gala has kind of really done and experienced, I think it's important, one, to acknowledge that within the South African environment, a lot of the work, perhaps in terms of strategic litigation, has happened kind of in the past, and yet we still face really huge challenges in thinking about one, violence, particularly against the LGBTQ community. In the South African context, in the last, well, over the last 2 years, we had 26 murders or hate crimes of LGBTIQ individuals. And I think that says something really important to us within the South African sense of, like, we have this whole array of really progressive legislation, and yet, it hasn't really seen many changes, particularly in the protection and safety of kind of the community. And so then what does that struggle look like, and particularly how we tap into and support the continuing struggles all across the continent. And one thing that I really wanted to perhaps then draw on and add to this conversation was really thinking about our collective challenge in fighting against this, what is termed as the anti-gender movement. And I think this is particularly the concerted efforts, particularly in recent years, of well-funded conservative groups, which are based in the US and also in parts of Europe and North America, who are kind of banded together and really fighting against all the important work that has been done. So it's really used to derail, for example, comprehensive sex education, particularly in the global South, where they still are able to really influence governments and institutions. And then I think, secondly, it's also around really instilling fears within communities. So once again, supporting very conservative religious groups, be it in South Africa or Kenya or Uganda, where it becomes a lot easier to once again target our communities as scapegoats for broader problems around inequality or access to education and all of that. And I think it also allows for a much stronger network in kind of working with their partners within kind of Europe in kind of making sweeping changes and really challenging a lot of the important work that has really happened. And that then raises the really important questions around how do we show solidarity, particularly for the work that's happening on the ground in many of these communities. And in that sense, I think questions around what kind of strategies are we using, particularly because in many of our contexts, we still have to really think critically about the safety of individuals who are putting themselves on the line in kind of taking on these struggles with authorities, with police, with governments, for example. And then secondly, how we're also working with our partners in kind of Europe and North America in challenging and influencing how these right-wing groups are funding a lot of this work that impacts us so drastically. And then how are we kind of really building up ourselves in ways that can speak to this kind of global anti-gender movement. And so, yeah, I think once again, from our perspectives as an archive, it's quite unique, I suppose, or interesting for us to really think about activism, because our traditional concepts of an archive would be one that's just this dusty repository of like old documents. But we feel that our work is far more radical, particularly in terms of giving this queer visibility, which is unapologetically African, and that really kind of seeks to use lived experiences as a way of challenging those that deny our existence all across the kind of continent, and then using that as a momentum for solidarity.
Thank you so much for this also very wonderful overview and picking up and making so many important points that we will now, I think we can tie together. Jerry, did you want to intersect directly on something that Keval said?
Absolutely, yes. I think, thank you, Keval. That was really wonderful to hear, and speaks a lot to the things that I've been thinking about, and a lot of the things that we've both been raising. I think one of the key things that we continue to see in East Africa is, I guess, a shared opposition, where there's a direct line between who's opposing efforts in Kenya to who's opposing efforts in Tanzania and efforts in Uganda, and across East Africa. There's a direct line to the ways that the political rhetoric is expressed and how it's framed, where we've kind of moved from 2013, where it was very blatant. It was very, I think it was very rudimentary how the opposition was framed, so much so that we had bills being shoved right, left, and center that called for stoning of homosexuals, and like literally we had a kill the gays bill in Kenya, and had a kill the gays bill that almost became an act in Uganda, right? And that has continued to carry over during the course of our activism. But we've also seen kind of that intention get more and more technical and sophisticated, so that just yesterday, our president-elect, in response to a question about homosexuality in Kenya and his administration, just basically mirror language that says something to the effect that homosexuality is a non-issue, which, sounds harmless, but is it really harmless, and which is very important, and kind of steps on what Keval is saying about erasure, because the moment that we're classified as a non-issue, then we're not considered in anything with the Kenya Bureau of Statistics, in HIV programming, in access to our rights. We're really not considered, and we know that when we're not considered, then we have no access at all, right? So I think it's been useful for us to continue to sit together. It's been useful for us to contextualize issues as they rise, not only within our countries, but then even within the surrounding countries. When we have bills in parliament, it's quite likely that our neighbors have something similar, right? We saw a few years back a very targeted push to deregister non-governmental organizations that had anything to do with sexuality in Kenya. Our colleagues in Uganda right now at SMAG are battling the same thing with the government, really cracking down on them and ordering for the closure of the organization. So the thing is that we do have so much shared opposition, and I think the onus is on us to have conversations that transcend our national programming, our domestic programming, which we have done. And I think in our conversation about what challenges have looked like, one would be very easily resourcing, right? That our opposition is so well resourced, so well structured, so it's literally in churches and in on TV, and we're this little organizations who, because of scarcity to some extent, work on very specific issues within our very specific localities. But yeah, I think that we're sitting here and we're having this conversation is also really key. That then we're kind of expanding the thought around what does the future look like, and how do we arrive there? Not just carrying the banner of our country, but carrying our siblings from across different countries with us. Yeah.
Among many points that you've both raised, I would love to pick up this last one that you mentioned, because I think it ties in a couple of the things that have been said before. So when we look at sort of the other side, they're very well funded. Like you said, we see this I think more and more professional movement that is also organized across borders, even though they have a very strong nationalistic sort of background, obviously, in their thinking. So what can be some of the resources, as you said, on different levels? Because I don't think we're just talking about monetary or fiscal resources, right? So what do you see as some of the resources that are needed in national and transnational activist movements to better grapple with a stronger, more and more proficient, stronger opposition? Not that they haven't been there before, but like you said, I think we do see this them professionalizing, more money flowing in there, and so on.
What I was thinking about, particularly as Njeri was speaking, and like thinking about particularly all these pieces of legislation, right, which are so similar in their wording, and also the arguments that are coming quite sophisticated, kind of shows the ways in which these right-wing organizations are kind of using the tools that we've had as kind of NGO organizations for such a long time against us now. So often you'll find that the way in which these translate into, like, I'll give you an example. In South Africa, particularly with the Department of Basic Education, we have a number of NGOs that are working to really create more inclusive policies within high schools, but also to change curriculum. And it's an open working group and platform. And now we've started having all of these organizations that are termed like family values or like family first, and they come on board speaking about how their only interests are those of the children. So that kind of like sophistication of like spin, really. And it takes me then back to what kind of ways of solidarity we can really show. So I think on the one hand, we do need to acknowledge that there's a huge challenge, particularly to funding activism within the global South. And that's not only in relation to what we're up against, but also if we think about the current context of, the last couple of years of COVID, where a lot of funding has been diverted into really kind of research and access around that. And then also the kind of war in Europe at the moment. And so then once again, it's like this complete shift in being like, oh, we have to focus on that. So I think it's once again like putting the pressure on, saying that, I wanted to add that often we now hear this conversation of like, yeah, the world has progressed so much on gender identity and sexual orientation. Is this really a struggle at the moment? And the emphatic answer is yes, it is, because of the challenges that we face. And then I also think reflectively around, one of the successful forms of activism that really took place during apartheid was student movements all across the globe, really pushing their governments and showing solidarity. And I feel like it's a lot harder for us to really create this network of like global solidarity. One, because often it's really co-opted into these like very like fancy technical, armchair activism of like posting on Instagram. And I think there's some level of importance to that, but it really doesn't have the same, I think, gravitas of us like really being able to communicate with younger individuals or movements in various localities and saying, how do we show that solidarity in ways that can really impact changes at the broader level? So I don't think we're necessarily tapping into that, and I think that would be quite important. And then secondly, I think thinking about how our campaigns, so for example, like strategic litigation, it's also, there's an element of like advocacy that also engages with communities, like really broadening the ways in which where we're thinking about the activism, so that it's kind of taking on this multi-pronged approach, which I know is challenging because often our organizations are so small. It's like, how do we do all of the things all at once? But yeah, I think that's potentially where there's opportunities for solidarity and the ways in which we can change some of the work that we're doing.
I'm happy to add on that as well. I think what we've seen done well has been cross-border partnerships around creating specific bodies of work, especially around research. I think in the last maybe 5 years, we've seen a 12-country research on, I forget the title, but around the lived realities of LGBTIQ LGBTIQ persons within this 12 countries within Eastern and Southern Africa, which I think was brilliantly done piece of work. We've seen organizations and individuals and activists form collectives to engage in specific bodies. I think we have the SOGI collective, the East African SOGI collective of the SEHPR, which is really wonderful that then that there are block issues that are advocated on with larger visibility within these spaces. I think different conversations around key issues that cut across borders, for example, with Kenya and Uganda, there's been a lot of conversation around refugees, the refugee crisis, the security issues with queer refugees in Kakuma and in Nairobi, and I've seen quite a lot of collaborations between different organizations working specifically on this specific thing, right? And so, and I think lastly, I think convenings have been very useful. I think there's been such a huge role with CFCS, with Pan-African ILGA, and specific spaces that are dedicated to conversations that are not necessarily domestic, that invite partnership, that invite collaboration, that invite different people on the table to discuss issues that cut across, the specific country. So I think that has been very key within a deliberation of transnational activism.
Yeah, and it's good to hear that there's also a variety of tools that you are employing and that there are, and picking out one that you've both mentioned a couple of times, and I'm not entirely sure if the audience is very familiar with strategic litigation campaigns, but maybe one of you or both of you can just say briefly what this means for you with regards to transnational activism, how it ties that in, and maybe give an example. And we don't have to go in depth about this point because we could have a whole session about it, and we did touch upon it in the session with Monica Tabengwa and Adrian Juko, but still, because you've both mentioned it quite a bit.
I'm pretty certain that Jerry will have a lot more to say as a kind of practicing lawyer, but I think one, if I take it back to the archive, it's always really interesting to see the ways in which very targeted legislation, particularly in terms of using that as the starting point for really thinking about broader changes, that can really be pushed through society, has always been a really useful way of or tactic employed by kind of LGBTIQ organizations. I mean, in the South African context, what's been interesting is the Jade September case, which is focused specifically on trans rights and those, particularly of those who are incarcerated. But that's really being a kind of springboard, which kind of shows the ways in which the courts could really be used to requiring government to comply with its own laws, and in kind of like changing. And there's been much broader conversations around that. I mean, in relation to thinking about the transnational activism, I think Njeri did mention that a lot of the jurisprudence from South Africa has been effectively used by advocates, in other legal cases which are in like Botswana or Namibia or even Zimbabwe. And those can then kind of create a more kind of broader African queer jurisprudence, which activists can kind of rely on. I think it also really allows for an important set of movement building, because there are ways of showing solidarity, particularly when these cases are being handed or judgments are being handed, and how we then kind of mobilize both locally as well as in different spaces to kind of use that as an opportunity to create more visibility.
I completely agree. I think it has been. I think strategic litigation is, as I said, is one of those really visible initiatives, right? And one specifically that we can harvest outcomes quickly, right? And I think it's a very direct linkage between judicial precedents in Botswana that's used in Kenya, right? And vice versa. I remember reading the decision, I think, at the High Court with the Botswana registration case, referencing the Kenyan registration case that at that point had been positively decided on by the High Court in Kenya. I think it's one of those, low-hanging fruit in terms of trying to show the direct advantages and the direct linkages between within transnational activism and within I guess that setup of work and of combining efforts. I think also with litigation around forced anal examinations, I think this is one of those really archaic practices that we've seen being practiced in Tunisia, Libya, West Africa, in Tanzania, the threat of it in Tanzania, the threat of it and the practice of it in Uganda, and in Kenya as well. And Kenya sort of began litigating around this issue just off chance. Literally, it was a situation where we had to apply for a stay of prosecutions because there was a criminal case and grant to the Constitutional Court. And I think around that same time, we were having conversations with activists from Uganda who were dealing with the exact same issue, right? And it needed a lot of back and forth conversation, a lot of exchanges around strategy, a lot of trying to figure out what would be best to put in place, at that point in time. I think even with regards to advocacy around bills and acts of parliament, right? The pushback that we saw in Kenya was very much inspired by the pushback that we had seen previously in Uganda when they were pushing back against the Anti-Homosexuality Act, and that's at the point that Kenya had in 2014 when Kenya had a similar act in the act in parliament, right? And I think how we see different actors move around. I think one of the things that was very unexpected for me was to see a conversation around religious leaders coming out of Uganda and being given space in Kenya to see the role of religious leaders in kind of repelling this types of legislation, and at that point, I think Kenya had been working with religious leaders for quite a long time, but hadn't necessarily seen their role in either strategic litigation, but also in national advocacy around such specific things, you know. So again, very, very easy. Well, not easy. Let me pull back. Let me let me pull back a lot. Not easy, but I think remarkable work done over time, which I continue to stand in awe of.
And Jerry, I was going to add that, yeah, the strategic part is also just about the hashtag work that is done by activists in really getting together and thinking about the strategies. And if I could just add, I think what's also interesting about the strategic litigation, and one of the strategies that are perhaps not as apparent, is that it's very useful because judges tend to listen to their peers and colleagues, and they don't necessarily want to be embarrassed in terms of their own legal thinking, which is why creating this huge body of like African jurisprudence, which really speaks to each other, is really effective. And we've seen the way in which these judgments play out, and the way in which they really do try and lean on each other's rulings. Is something that activists have used quite effectively in really like pushing them to make these judgments in our favor. And yeah, so I think that's a very, very important and necessary strategy.
Yeah, thank you so much for elaborating on this point. And I think it also takes us to back to one of the things that Carol said, where division of labor is actually one of the aspects that is very important, but also challenging, because you can't do everything at once. You sort of, it sounds like you are doing everything at once from what you're telling us, but I would love to touch upon this a little more. So what kind of role does division of labor in transnational connectivity, transnational networks play? What can be advantages here, but what is also maybe challenging in this regard? And I mean, this can be in regards to strategic litigation campaigns, as far as I understand, but I mean, I think it also factors into other strategies, campaigning strategies.
Go ahead. The one thing I was thinking about as you were speaking about the division of labor, and just going back to the earlier point of the really hard work that has to happen, is I think the real kind of critical challenge of capacity that a lot of small NGOs face, particularly those who are, really having to think strategically about the litigation aspect, but then also realizing that our work really involves dealing with people's lives, and often the kind of impact of that on our communities, and activists themselves, who have to straddle this really difficult line of like putting these things to litigation, but then still dealing with individuals whose lives might not immediately change, because even once judgments come out, the change happens kind of much more gradually. It then requires also to once again, once the judgments are out, also to then hold people accountable, because there's a lot of inertia, particularly from governments, in kind of carrying that out. And so I think part of that is really about one, increasing our capacities to do the work that we do. And I think important to that is also linking the importance of like mental health and well-being, not only for our communities, but for our activists who work in these really, really difficult and challenging environments. And often I think that leads to a really high level of burnout, particularly amongst those who are advocating for the rights. So yeah, that was an immediate thought that came to mind.
I also was thinking about funding, and specifically how that has been a conversation transnationally. I think it particularly has been one of those things that we can we can point at and say it's quite rare that we have a specific funder who only funds a country, a specific country, and a specific issue in that country, right? A lot of our funders are, and a lot of the dedicated funding in the continent for LGBTQ issues has been spread out across countries. And so creating a space for, I think, intentional practice, building of intentional practice around funding. I think developing models that work for that specific region, right? And I think also has given space for activist organizations, movements, collectives to engage directly with funding and the people who make decisions about that funding, and kind of shape how, and kind of try to shape how that how that would roll out in the most effective ways for them. I know that there's a East African study circle. I think that puts thought around, I guess, philanthropy and what that space looks like, and what it potentially would look like in an ideal, in ideal situations. I think and when you say division of labor, I thought, for some reason, I thought about Pride in Uganda, and a conversation that some friends of mine were having differently about how, as Kenyans, we used to take ourselves so seriously about our work and would only go be joyful in Uganda for Pride, and and I think it's really important that and transnationally, we have the conversation about joy, about how we distress, about, just to create specific space for that joy. And even in that, and I think it sucks that even in that, we have to factor in security measures and alternatives, and what happens if this and the other happens. But I think it's really important that we have our siblings across borders who have set priorities that give space and time for that joy, and it's useful and continues to be useful for us, to learn from that, to borrow that, and so now we see a lot more people, being interested in Pride, and and making merry and parades and creating that space for that specific thing. I think also the other thing that I've realized is that there's some countries and some people who've intentionally worked hard around mentoring the next generation of activists and the next generation of people who engage in the spaces that we engage, and that has been really useful for me as an activist and as an organizer within my country that has not given has not specifically given as much time, as much intention, as much thought as I've seen other people do, and that kind of has pulled us out and began to challenge us and to ask us, then what then, right? We're so burnt out. There's so many of us who are ready to take a corporate job or to be a house spouse and be kept, and leave all of this activism things behind us. But then what comes next? And it's really important for me to see that that's happening, and it's not happening in just a specific country, that there's intention, there's thought, and there's space and efforts that are put to kind of mentor those younger activists, those
seems like we've lost Jerry there. Hopefully the connection will come back. Keval, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, as Jerry was speaking, I'm just kind of in full agreement with that. And then once again, I think that's where the work of the Queer Archive is so radical, because it really is also about showing a visibility, particularly to the outside world, where often Africa, particularly when it comes to, our challenges with activism, feels like this really dark space. And yet, despite that, those really difficult challenges, there are queer people and communities and organizations that show and reflect remarkable lives of beauty and grace and love, and ones which are just, as I said, unapologetically African in our understanding and queerness. And I think it is important to celebrate that, amongst ourselves, but also showing that narrative to the outside world, I think is important.
Yes, absolutely. It's really, yeah, this is, of course, happening, because this is what happens, but it's really unfortunate. I think we've now lost Jerry for good for now. Well, I really hope they'll be able to come back.
Me too.
I think we'll just keep going, and I'll have an eye on my emails.
Sure.
Okay. I did want to go back to something that you both have also mentioned, and these are the different areas, arenas, rooms on the regional, but also the continental levels, but possibly also the international level, if we look at the UN, for example, where conversations are happening, where exchange is happening. I just wanted to, I see Jerry at least in the list now again. That's good. And I wanted to jump into that, or jump back to that, and ask what role do these different arenas play with regards to, not necessarily only networking, but what kind of prospects are there for activists to advance LGBTIQ plus rights?
I think that's it is an important question to raise, particularly in the current environment where we're looking at how international groups and organizations are kind of responding to the multiple crises that we see all around the world, whether it's like climate change and kind of the ineffectiveness, particularly because the power imbalance still continues to play a huge role, where a lot of and then the internal problems within Europe and the US, which continue to then impact on how these organizations like the UN kind of engage with communities. I mean, with partner organizations. It was quite interesting to see the support that the special rapporteur at the UN on LGBT issues has been able to really get a lot of member states to support the work that's happened through that organization. But also important to note the significant backlash, particularly from those countries where who are completely against any kind of discussions around gender happening. And once again, there it's important to see which nation states are really using their positions to kind of support the global anti-gender movement. I think those arguments also need to be quite nuanced in the ways in which they engage, particularly with nation states in Africa, particularly because there's quite a lot of politicizing that happens, and in that regard, I don't think it's often very helpful for activists on the ground when on the global stage, some of these African nations are kind of perceived or see this kind of outer Western threat that's impinging on the ways in which they operate their governments. So I think the arguments perhaps need to be a little bit more nuanced in that, but I think there's definitely ways in which those spaces need to be utilized. I'm just kind of more thinking out aloud about the effectiveness, particularly of these, kind of global stages, particularly given all the challenges that we currently face. I'm not sure if that answers the question directly.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it adds to the many thoughts that that I have around this, and I was only able to give you 80% of my concentration because I was trying to get Jerry back on board. And Thiruna, can you please enable Jerry's video? Sorry for now using this space to say this, but yeah, we have Jerry back, but can't see her yet. Okay. So glad that you're back. Maybe we can get you on board with sort of pitching the question that I just asked Keval as well to you. So you were speaking about different arenas and rooms and, oh goodness, did we lose Keval now? Okay. So we were speaking about different rooms and arenas for interaction and as platforms to have conversations around the advancement of LGBTIQ+ rights on the regional and continental, but also maybe international level, if you look at the UN, for example. So what kind of role can these spaces, these arenas play with regards to activists, networks, individuals coming in and fighting for and advancing rights of LGBTIQ+ citizens?
I think to answer that question, I would have to work from an assumption that these systems are already malleable and would therefore be able to take into consideration the questions, the concerns, the demands of activists across the region. And short of that, I think then the reverse would be that we have a responsibility as activists, as organizers, as movement builders to find the best possible ways to make these systems that are usually quite rigid to work for us, right? Where we spend so much effort and I think we involve so much of our thought and so much of our resources in activism within specific spaces. Let's talk about the UN. Let's even talk about closer home, the African Commission. And we have, I don't want to call it little, but it's quite scarce what we can pull out and say that for the last 20 years of activism and 10 years of engagement in this space, this is the one thing that we can show. This is the one resolution that we can show. And true, we can, and we've been very crafty, and we're very talented in applying some of these wins as far and wide as we can. But it does also beg the question, whether there's a balance, how equal it is. I don't advocate that we pull back from engagement with, with the UN system, with the African Union system, with the East African Court of Justice. Absolutely, these are spaces, because of who we are and because of the work that we do, we must absolutely engage with these spaces. But I think it's a little tough to kind of imagine what then the system becomes, so it accommodates the questions and the concerns that we have as a people. I think what I would say would be that we have not, in my opinion, we haven't exhausted the breadth and the length of how we can make some of the systems work for us. I think we can have a long conversation about how, for example, scholars are useful for us in these spaces, right? How do they breach that high, lofty UN high-level meeting, and concerns that are arising out of a rural queer community that is being routinely harassed, for example, by police officers or by rebels in spaces of conflict. So I think that we still have allies, we still have resources, we still have people that we can put to task. I think there's different ways that we can, or different methods of engagement that we can try out, maybe, and see whether we can achieve something different. But yeah, that's kind of where my thinking sits on that.
I mean, it probably has to do also something with really scarce resources on the side of your organizations as a broader sense. Where do we actually spend our energy, money, women and men, and people power, and where do we engage, and where it's actually helpful and necessary? And from what you're saying, it sounds like there's a lot happening on the national level, which then sort of spills and which then influences through transnational work other spaces that are more on the regional or continental level, but not necessarily these systems that weren't necessarily built for the engagement of probably more generally like marginalized groups of people among this LGBTIQ plus communities. Keval, you have enabled your, did you want to jump in, please?
No, I mean, as Njeri was speaking, I was also thinking particularly around representation, and I think that matters, like having, you know, queer members and activists who move into these positions where they're able to engage with kind of, you know, within these kind of various structures. And often that's a huge challenge. And I think that the Njeri's commented on, particularly around scholars and how we haven't necessarily tapped into strategically thinking about which organizations do we require representation in, who do we put forward as kind of like our advocates within those spaces. You know, there is a lot of, I think, potential for opportunities there. And I think the representation is important because it can only really change a lot of these structures from inside. It's much harder to do it from the outside.
Yes, and this is the most perfect bridge that I could have asked for. And in our little pre-session, we did discuss this, and we said we do want to bring this to the table. So thanks for both of you for raising this already. As these conversations are specifically tailored to bring together activists and scholars in the field from multidisciplinary backgrounds. We're quite heavy on the lawyers, I have to say, and from the people with the legal backgrounds, but we do have some political scientists and some other people at the table. And I would just, be very, very interested to hear from you where you see, and again, we can come back to these phrases, which are more than phrases, but like challenges, prospects in the realm of working together, sitting at the table together, and going forward, obviously, as scholars, activists, talking about this, and then who are interested, engaged in the advancement of rights for LGBTIQ plus persons. Does anybody, I mean...
Oh, sorry. I was also wondering if there were any kind of questions from people on the who perhaps were interested in that. But yeah, I think the environments like these are particularly important. And to just follow on from what you're saying, I think kind of more interdisciplinary approaches. So let's say lawyers also kind of understanding where, you know, in addition to like the strategic points of litigation, how does that advocacy work where we're engaging with communities at the same time as these cases are going through court, you know, so that there's kind of this two-pronged approach, I think is quite important and necessary.
I think, I had raised this in our prep conversation, that in a lot of arenas where we kind of historically hadn't assumed that scholarly type of work would be the most useful thing, or would be the thing that that arrives us to our destination, right? And I was talking specifically about our decriminalization petition, where in the decision, the justices basically referenced a lack of evidence to show that there was discrimination against queer people because of the existence of of the sections of the law. And I remember us, all of us, a heartbroken movement, kind of talking about it and being like, but what is it that they need to see? Like, should we bring the bodies on the street? Like, what is it that we need to show you? So it registers with you that this is happening. And I think one of the things that we had to really highlight within our litigation strategy is the necessity of specialists within specific, on specific areas, who then we brought in to act as expert testimony, to really break it down to the bench, for them to understand what the issues were, what is it that we're talking outside of the legal jargon, which is very grand. What are we really saying, right? And I think also to bring in research that had been peer reviewed, that had been useful, that had been I guess used by different bodies, different UN bodies, different governmental bodies in the country, that says that this is the data, these are the numbers. Because what then ends up happening is that the data that we have from NGOs, for example, Legal Help carries and stores a lot of data from our interactions with our client, and so we have a lot of reports, a lot of case files, a lot of pictures, whatever, numbers, whatever it is that you imagine, to be stored within the legal aid office. But that doesn't seem to be enough. It doesn't seem to be the thing that convinces them. It doesn't seem to be the thing that carries them over. But what we see is that there's the specific partiality to articles written by people from UNAIDS, people from specific international bodies, that then seems convincible to them, and so I think there's quite a huge role to play there. I think the other thing is that when we talk about strategic litigation, we also carry within that conversation strategic communication, and that has been specifically useful to us in trying to figure out how best to either break down the information to lay people, so that it's understood what we're asking of this court of law, but then also to work towards the shift of the hearts and minds. And I think that we've kind of seen move from, I think, what would put out as communities, as the comms person of such and such an organization, to actual dedicated effort to study what are the prevailing thoughts and attitudes in a specific country or in a specific area about a specific thing, and then how best do we approach, how best do we present this, And so I think those two areas are where I've seen a lot of interactions with scholars, with data, with researchers, with developers around the work that we're currently doing.
Okay, yeah. And I think from a scholarly perspective, I think it's so important to, obviously important, but also great, and I'm very grateful for the, you know, all the reports and all the written and, you know, video and any kinds of materials that that you have online on websites, in social media presence, and I think because there's also this I think danger of overly stretching the resources of activists from the scholarly side, and people coming in and asking the same questions over and over again, and stealing even more time from your important work away. So I mean, this speaks to the amazing work that Gala is doing, obviously, and then it also speaks to having these kinds of resources on your websites, and data from your side sort of available, which then can inform research and research practices and developing research questions. But I think there is a lot of room still, and it's a difficult room to maneuver, I think, but there is room for more engagement and a more from all the sides, a more informed, consensual coming together of building research questions, research methodology, a theory, but then at the end of the day as well, producing data that can be used for real life, making real life changes, and not ivory tower theoretical discussions. So I mostly have questions, but not answers. But I think there is, this is somehow something we all need to sort of get better at, or there is room for improvement. What would be your you've mentioned a few, but like what would be your wish list, your something that you would want to bring to the table to say to the community that is now listening in and will watch this video, hopefully? What are ways of engaging that are specifically helpful and in that you see the most need for going forward?
You know, I think what we've really found useful and important at Gala, particularly because on the one hand, we're a community-based archive, and so our engagement with community is quite important. And in that sense, those who kind of, you know, give to the archives and share their experiences and stories, we feel it's really important that there's a relationship of trust with that knowledge, because we're engaging with people's lives. And for us, it's then requiring those researchers and scholars who are interested in doing this work to really understand the kind of importance of that relationship, right? Taking people into our trust, and that means that a lot of the research and scholarly work, we have to really think about and challenge ourselves around where it becomes extractive and where it really is coming back and giving back to the community. And I think important in that regard is thinking about the ways, and there's been some really important scholarly work, as Njeri mentioned, but how do we then share that work back with the community? So I think accessibility is really important. And then, you know, one of the exciting things about the archive is really thinking about creative ways in which we share our research and knowledge with communities, you know, and art, I think, is such an important tool in the ways in which we engage and continue to engage. I think language is another important point of accessibility. But yeah, I think it needs to be a conversation because, you know, scholars really need the communities in order to continue with their kind of scholarly work. And at the same time, we know that research is important, but it's about the communication and the sharing and how that happens, so that we're all kind of sitting on a more kind of equal plane, I think is really important.
I completely agree with Keval's words, like literally. I think the reality on and my experience and the experience of colleagues that I work with has been that a lot of research that we've engaged with has been quite extractivist of the realities, of the truths of activists, that doesn't seem to give back in any sort of way, right? And so it has ended up creating a space that's I think a bit antagonistic, right? And I think that needs to change. I think that narrative needs to change. I think for all of the requests that we get for data, for someone to visit with us for the 3 months, to meet members of our community, and to curate specific gatherings so that they can extract data from that specific gathering, like it really takes from what's already there, right? I think this engagement should be honoring of the lives and the truths of the communities that we're working in, that we're trying to study and we're trying to collect data from, but then also should also honor that, like should also be honoring of them, right? And I think it doesn't take a lot. I think conversation and intentionality around that in engagement really eases it up. I think also the only thing that I would add is that I think it's up to, and I keep saying this, that it can be for us to imagine how much more useful people or resources or institutions could be to the work. I think when you possess particular gifts, resources, talents, then you can imagine, how useful you could be. So how about you approach and say, listen, this is what I'm good at, right? I need this, but also this is how about we barter? How about I help, come with an imagination, because if say to me, Keval is available, ask them for whatever. I don't know the breadth. I know how deep Keval's pockets are, so I wouldn't be like, give me 10,000 USD today, or whatever, or put this together for me, or, or mobilize this group of people for me, right? So I think if we, in the same ways that we imagine, in the same ways that we imagine that that as specific community, a specific organization, that specific movements would be useful to the research work, to the scholarly work that we're doing. I think we can also imagine how the reverse comes to play, how then we can be useful to them, right? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that, for this very, also concrete input. I think this is sometimes what these kinds of discussions are lacking, that we sort of move to a more concrete space, which is obviously sometimes difficult because it's very contextualized and it depends on time and space and the people that are involved and so on. So it's hard to generalize, but anyway, I think this is a helpful way to move forward. I don't see, and I haven't received actually any questions from the audience. This is why I've been just posing my questions. This would be sort of the kind of the last chance to jump in here. If not, that's okay as well. You can just consume. That's okay. I think I hope this has been informative and inspiring and insightful for everybody involved. And I can't believe it's already over again, almost. And the 6 months and the 6 discussions have passed very, very quickly. I'm a little bit sad that this is the last session, but it's been really amazing. And I think also just today, what you, the insight that you've shared with us, tied together so many of the aspects that we've been discussing throughout among scholars and activists. And we spoke very much about all these different levels and dimensions of these legal and societal challenges for the community in different contexts on the national, but also at regional and continental levels, and able to input, I think, reflect on the inputs and also sometimes the discrepancies between the lived realities and very theoretical discussions that we might be having, and really pinpointing some of these challenges on specific topics. What I think has become also very clear is that we utilize this space, but we also need more spaces to bring together different voices to talk about specific issues, but also in a more general sense for the engagement between scholars and activists and people involved, and need for exchange and also reflection in this sense. And without that, and without talking a lot more than I have already have today, I would just love to invite the rest of the team to the stage, to our imaginary stage here, to join the panel of today, and that's from the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender, Justice Mezzani, from the Center for Human Rights, Ayes Gunru and Hiruna Naidu, and also from Marburg, this is Andini Hassana. And and please, Carol and Jerry, please do join us again. I see that you've turned off your cameras, but please join us again, because you've been so instrumental today in having this discussion, this last session. Thank you all so much for participating, for making this happen, for giving these wonderful insights and input. Thank you so much to the team for the, I think, amazing work and amazing discussions we've been able to pull together and making this all happen. It's been really exciting and just an absolute honor for me. Yes, so thank you all. And to the audience and to everybody who's listening in, feel free to provide us with feedback in this comment section. We will send around a questionnaire to everybody who has taken part of in the discussions. And the good news is we are planning to continue this. So we are planning to continue this in some form next year. So please also feel free to suggest topics that you would want us to discuss. Yeah, and then I think I'll leave it at that. And I just, again, want to share my sincere thank yous to the amazing panelists for today, Jerry and Carol, and to the whole team. And I'm sure that would be a big round of applause if we were in a real setting, which we aren't, but yeah.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Marielle, for chairing the session so wonderfully. Thank you.
Thank you as well. It really has been the highlight of my day.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day and all the very best.